All right, we should be good to go now. No more interruptions, no more misrecording. Let's talk about rye. There are a lot of different types of rye out there, and if you've ever tried a bourbon that's a high rye, or you've tried just a rye in general, it's inevitable that you've tried one and realized that, hey, this tastes different than this one. And you may have wondered, what's the get here? What's the catch? Is it due to just the area, the distillery, the mash bill, the type of rye, the barrel influence, the weather? The answer is yes. There's a lot of things that go into whiskey and making whiskey taste a specific way, but what we're going to be focusing on today is going to be the style and the type of rye. So let's dive into the type of rye first. If I were to pick this bottle up and say, this is a rye whiskey, I'm not wrong, but that is the equivalent of saying, like with a red bottle of wine, that, hey, this bottle of red wine is red wine. I'm not really telling you what it's going to taste like. I just said, hey, this is rye. Hey, this is red wine. We know that for red wine that there are specific varietals that are going to go into it. It could be a Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Merlot, whatever. It can be a lot of different things. The same goes for rye. When we say rye, that's actually an umbrella term for all of these subcategories of rye, whether that's going to be a Haslett rye, dark pumpernickel rye, a specific heirloom grain of rye, a winter rye, a hybrid, or whatever it may be. There are going to be specific types of ryes, and each one is going to taste a specific way. For the most part, when you are going to buy a bottle of rye whiskey, it is most likely going to be a hybrid rye that they're using. Hybrid ryes are just going to be a little bit more mellow. It's also going to be a lot easier to grow them and get a high yield, because that's what they were designed and hybrided to do, was be very easy to use for most things when it comes to rye, whether it's rye bread or rye whiskey. The next most common you're going to see is going to be an heirloom grain. Heirloom is going to be one that places like New Riff love to do, where it's going to be a rye that is already in the area and it's going to not be blended in, or I shouldn't say blended, it's not going to be hybrided with something else. It's just going to be that specific style of rye. And then the other one that's going to be really popular is going to be the winter rye. You're going to see this a lot. Winter rye is going to be a little bit more of a spicy flavor, whereas a lot of the heirlooms are going to be a lot more complex, have a lot more going on, but are much harder to work with, typically, than a hybrid rye. So those are going to be your style, or excuse me, not style. Those are going to be your different types of rye that are out there. Two other ones that I just want to quick point out, if you really want to try something a little different. If you can't get over to New Riff and you can't find any of their specific ones, because most of their heirloom grains that they use, you have to try at the distillery. But Middle West out of Columbus, Ohio is doing something really fun with their dark pumpernickel rye. It's one of the best ryes I've ever had. This guy is a ton of fun, really interesting, and not, again, a normal rye. Another one is going to be Far North. This is going to be a Minnesota distillery, and when I say they are nerdy about this, I mean they are nerdy about this. They wrote an entire paper, essentially, after doing research on what type of rye is going to best grow for them and produce the best type of whiskey. They weren't just looking at flavor, they were also looking at how well does it malt, how much yield do we get, how easy is it to grow, how hard is it, all of these factors. I'll try to put that little study down below in the description, but if I forget, just look up Far North Rye research, and you should be able to find all of their findings on it, and it's super fun to read through. Yes, very nerdy, but I think it's enjoyable. From there, the next thing is going to be, what is the style? For the most part, we're going to talk about Kentucky, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Indiana rye, or MGP. Starting with Kentucky, this is going to be most likely the type of rye that you've had if you've had a rye whiskey or a high rye bourbon. It's going to be mostly rye at 51%, because you have to be minimum 51% to be a rye, and then a lot of corn, the rest malted barley. So it's going to be, again, more mellow and a lot sweeter. Next up, you're going to have Maryland, so places like Sagamore Spirits. And again, if you haven't had this guy, fantastic bottle to try. They are going to be around that 60 to 70% rye. So a little bit spicier, but not too crazy. From there, you're going to have Pennsylvania or Monongahela rye, which is going to be a lot more robust and have a lot more going on, much higher rye content. And then finally, MGP or Indiana, their classic one. You've again probably heard this thrown around a lot when people say it's 95.5. Talking about 95% malted barley. That's not correct. They're talking 95% rye, 5% malted barley. Now, that doesn't mean each place only does that style. For instance, New Riff out of Newport, Kentucky, this 6-year, right? Yeah, this is the 6-year. This 6-year malted rye, it's 100% malted rye. Very different than what you're going to get from most other places that are going to produce a rye whiskey. So you do have to look at it a little bit more closely, look to see where something's distilled, look to see what percentages they're using. That's going to give you a really good clue. But if you can figure out what type of rye they're using, that's also going to help a lot. So again, for instance, this far north, I could tell you this is 80% rye, 10% corn, 10% malted barley. And that does give you a good idea of what it's going to taste like. But they take it even a step further and they go, this is 80% Hazlitt rye, 10% Minnesota 13 corn, and 10% Synergy malt barley. So they get into the nerdy details about what type of grain they're using, so you can start to understand a little bit more of, hey, this is going to taste like blank. Now, why even go into all of this? Why do we care? One, because a lot of people assume that, hey, I just don't like rye, which might be the case. But I do think there are good varietals out there that you could try that you might actually like. Typically, when I'm talking to someone and they're like, hey, I don't like rye, I'm going to give them one of these three, either the Sagamore Spirits Far North or the Middle West Dark Pumpernickel Rye. Like I said, this one turns a lot of people onto rye. So knowing that there are different styles out there and some styles are going to play better and they're going to taste better to you than some of these other styles. Personally, I don't really like the Kentucky style of rye where it's that high corn in the mash bill, or if a rye is going to come off as spearminty, that's typically not my jam. I like it when it's a little bit more of this dark baking note, like baking spices, those notes, which again is one you get from this. So if you're in my camp, get this. You might not be able to find the cast strength version, but if you can, get it. You can always water it down so you can lower the proof. But if you can find the regular version, that's also delicious. They also have a ton of finishing versions of this, and I haven't tried one that I don't like yet. Not sure what that says about me or their distillery, but it's good. It's worth trying. But to know that there are a lot of different types of rye out there, and depending on where you're getting your rye, what type of rye it is, are all going to dictate whether something's going to fit your palate or not. And once you find, hey, this type does fit it, then you can start trying more from that area, trying more from that distillery, and you might find some other really, really good offerings. So I appreciate you guys sticking around to the end. I know this was extremely nerdy, diving into what type of rye makes my whiskey, but I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you guys go try some new ryes. So if you haven't already, like this video, comment on it, subscribe. I would really appreciate it. But till next time, guys, cheers.